alone in the midnight deluge. With the way home severed, the only sanctuary is the man whose very name has been a synonym for enmity for years. A chance encounter or the beginning of another storm? Our story begins. The air tasted of copper and ozone, a harsh metallic tang that coated the back of Hermione's throat with every ragged breath she drew. It was not a gentle autumn drizzle, but a punishing, vertical torrent that seemed intent on washing away the very stone of the London streets. The deluge hammered against the pavement, bouncing back up in stinging, icy shards that soaked through the hem of her heavy wool cloak, dragging it down like a lead weight against her shivering calves. She stood at the perimeter of the magical barricade, her fingers curled tight around the smooth vinewood of her wand within the deep pocket of her coat. Her knuckles ached with the strain, drained of blood from the biting cold. 10 yards ahead, the stone bridge that connected this damp, labyrinthine borough to her own neighborhood was completely gone. In its place was a jagged, smoking chasm, the remnants of the blast still hissing violently as the torrential rain struck the superheated rubble. Aurors in dark cloaks swarmed the opposite bank, their lumos spells casting sickly, erratic yellow beams through the dense sheet of water. The anti-apparition wards they had hastily erected hummed with a violent, static energy. The frequency vibrated against Hermione's molars, a low, oppressive pressure that made the air feel thick and unbreathable. There would be no magical transit tonight. The Ministry had locked down the grid. The flu network in the nearby public houses had been severed to prevent the perpetrators from slipping away, and the sky was heavily monitored. To kick off from the ground on a broomstick right now would invite a stunner to the chest from an overzealous hit wizard. She was stranded. Hermione closed her eyes, the freezing water plastering her normally unruly curls flat against her cheeks and neck. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled into her spine. It had been a grueling 14-hour shift in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She was empty. She possessed no more reserves of patience, no more adrenaline to fuel a detour through the winding, unfamiliar Muggle transit lines that were likely flooded anyway. She was simply a woman standing in the dark, shivering violently, paralyzed by the sheer insurmountable inconvenience of a shattered bridge. She dragged a heavy hand over her face, wiping away the water that blinded her, and opened her eyes to assess the grim reality of her surroundings. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the flooded asphalt. It was within one of those elongated shadows that the darkness seemed to solidify. Hermione's grip on her wand tightened instinctively, the rough grain of the wood pressing a sharp indent into her palm. She did not draw it, but her stance shifted, muscles locking in preparation for an altercation. The figure did not rush. It moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, stepping out from the recessed doorway of a closed apothecary and into the harsh, flickering amber light of the street lamp. The rain slicked his pale hair down, turning the usually immaculate platinum into a dark, tarnished silver. He wore no cloak, only a heavy, charcoal-grey Muggle trench coat that clung to the sharp angles of his shoulders, completely saturated by the downpour. Draco Malfoy stopped 3 paces away. The atmospheric pressure between them shifted instantly. It was no longer just the hum of the aura wards. It was a sudden, tactile friction that crawled up Hermione's arms, a magnetic pull of shared history and unresolved tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. They had not spoken in months. Their paths at the ministry rarely crossed, and when they did, it was across crowded atriums or heavily guarded courtrooms. He existed in the periphery of her world, a ghost of the war trying to carve out a quiet, unnoticed existence in the margins of society. Yet here he was, staring at her through the relentless sheet of water, his silver eyes completely unreadable, devoid of the malice that used to define his gaze when they were children. "The bridge is gone," Malfoy stated. His voice was a low, rough baritone that barely carried over the roar of the rain and the hissing rubble. It wasn't a question, nor was it a mocking observation. It was a bleak statement of fact. "I have eyes, Malfoy," Hermione snapped, the defensive reflex kicking in before she could temper it. Her jaw trembled violently as she spoke, betraying the severe chill that was rapidly setting into her core. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a futile attempt to conserve whatever microscopic amount of body heat she had left. He didn't flinch at her tone. His expression remained entirely impassive, a perfectly sculpted mask of marble. But his gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to the violent shudder racking her shoulders. He shoved his hands deeper into the pockets of his soaked coat. Hermione watched the fabric pull taut across his chest, noticing the subtle, rigid set of his jaw. He was cold too. The realization was strangely grounding. "The wards stretch for a 3-mile radius," he continued, his tone devoid of inflection, staring over her shoulder at the flashing aura lights rather than looking directly at her. "They've sealed the Muggle underground entrances at the perimeter, suspicion of cursed artifacts planted in the tunnels. You aren't getting across the river tonight, Granger." "I will figure something out," she said stubbornly, though her voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. She sounded small, even to her own ears. "I can walk to the edge of the wards and apparate from there." Malfoy finally turned his head, his pale eyes fixing on hers. The raw intensity of his stare was a jarring impact that made her breath hitch. "In this deluge? In your current state?" He took a half-step forward, closing a fraction of the distance between them. The scent of him, sharp petrichor, dark bergamot, and the faint, bitter trace of stale smoke, cut through the metallic smell of the destroyed bridge. "You're practically vibrating out of your shoes from hypothermia. By the time you walk 3 miles in this storm, you won't have the magical core strength left to safely splinch a fingernail, let alone transport yourself across London." "What do you care?" she shot back, the words laced with a sudden, desperate venom. It was easier to be angry. Anger was warm. Anger was familiar. The vulnerability of standing frozen and helpless in front of Draco Malfoy was unacceptable. He absorbed the verbal strike without a blink. His exterior remained entirely restrained, but Hermione's observant eyes caught the briefest, sharpest tightening of the muscles feathered along his cheekbone. He looked away, staring down at the flooded pavement between their boots. "I don't," he murmured, the words almost lost to the wind. "But leaving a war heroine to freeze to death on a street corner while I walk back to a warm fire seems like the sort of headline the Prophet would crucify me for. I have enough ghosts." He didn't say it with a sneer. There was no melodrama in his declaration, no plea for sympathy. It was delivered with a hollow, resigned cadence that spoke volumes of a man profoundly tired of his own existence. He didn't wait for her to process the admission. "My flat is 2 streets down, on this side of the barricade," Malfoy said, his voice returning to that clipped, pragmatic neutrality. He pulled his right hand from his pocket, gesturing vaguely to the dark, narrow alley behind him. Hermione's eyes snagged on the heavy silver ring on his index finger, the metal biting into his stark, white, freezing skin. "It's dry. There is a flu connection, though I suspect it's currently blocked by the Ministry lockdown. You can wait out the worst of the storm, dry your cloak, and leave when the wards drop." Hermione stared at him, her mind sluggishly trying to process the variables. Draco Malfoy offering her shelter. Not his family's sprawling dark manor. My flat. The concept of him living independently in a narrow, muggle-adjacent street in London was a reality she had not prepared herself to navigate. She weighed her options. Behind her, the bridge hissed and crumbled further into the black water of the Thames. The wind howled down the street, driving the freezing rain straight into her face. Her teeth were chattering so hard they ached. "Why do you live in this borough?" she asked, a diversionary tactic born of pure instinctive hesitation. She needed to understand the environment before she stepped into it. "Because it is quiet," he answered simply. His pale eyes locked onto hers once more, stripping away the pretense of casual conversation. The stare was an anchor in the chaotic storm. "And because it is far away from Wiltshire. Are you coming, Granger, or are you going to stand there until you turn to stone?" The visceral alignment of their situation finally outweighed her historic prejudices. She was freezing. He was offering a door. Hermione gave a stiff, jerky nod, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Malfoy didn't smile. He didn't offer a triumphant smirk. He merely turned on his heel, his saturated coat sweeping heavily in a dark arc, and began to walk toward the shadowed alley. He did not look back to see if she was following. Hermione forced her numb legs to move. The leather of her boots squelched against the flooded pavement as she fell into step behind him. The physical proximity in the narrow, claustrophobic alleyway was immediate. The brick walls on either side seemed to press inward, forcing her to walk directly in his wake. The broad line of his shoulders cut through the biting wind, inadvertently shielding her from the worst of the gale. She kept her eyes fixed on the damp collar of his coat, her mind racing with a chaotic swarm of doubts and defensive strategies. She catalogued every shadow, every uneven cobblestone, keeping her wand hand firmly entrenched in her pocket. She was stepping out of the storm and walking directly into the unknown territory of a man she had spent her entire adolescence fighting. They reached a heavy, dark wooden door at the end of the alley. The iron knocker was rusted, the stonework around the frame weathered and old. Malfoy pressed his palm flat against the wood. A faint, silver pulse of magic rippled outward from his hand, recognizing his magical signature. The heavy deadbolts within the door clicked backward with a loud metallic finality. He pushed the door open, revealing a steep, dimly lit stairwell that smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and cedar. The warmth rolling out from the interior was a physical entity, washing over Hermione's frozen skin and making her shiver even harder in response. Malfoy stepped inside, pausing on the first step. He turned slightly, holding the heavy door open, his body half submerged in the shadows of the stairwell, half illuminated by the dying street lamp behind her. He waited in complete silence, his gaze fixed on her with a heavy, expectant intensity. The rain lashed at her back, urging her forward, while the dark unknown of his private world loomed before her. Hermione took a breath of the icy air, stepped over the threshold, and crossed into the warmth. The heavy, rusted oak door snapped shut behind them, severing the aggressive howl of the wind and the violent percussion of the rain with the absolute finality of a vault ceiling. In the sudden, ringing quiet of the stairwell, the chaotic sounds of the ruined street were muffled into a distant underwater murmur. The only immediate noises were the hollow echo of their waterlogged boots against the ancient floorboards and the ragged, shallow cadence of Hermione's breathing. She stood frozen for a fraction of a second at the base of the steep, narrow staircase. A puddle of dark rainwater rapidly pooled around the soles of her boots, staining the worn wood. She was acutely aware of the claustrophobic dimensions of the space. The walls were close, the air thick with the smell of dried sage, beeswax, and the biting metallic chill they had dragged inside with them. The ambient magic of the building hummed, a low defensive frequency that prickled along the damp, freezing skin of her forearms. Malfoy did not pause to check if she was paralyzed by second thoughts, nor did he offer a guiding hand. He was already ascending, his long legs taking the steep wooden steps with a measured, silent grace that belied the heavy, saturated wool of his charcoal coat. The garment dripped rhythmically, leaving a trail of dark, glistening spots on the runner. Hermione forced her hand to release its death grip on the smooth vinewood of her wand, though she deliberately kept it entrenched in her pocket. She trailed behind him, her soaked cloak dragging heavily against the edges of the steps. With every upward movement, a profound tremor of apprehension resonated in her chest. She was voluntarily walking into the private sanctuary of a man who had once stood by while she bled on his drawing-room floor. The cognitive dissonance of the situation was a jarring impact against her deeply ingrained instincts. They reached the second-floor landing. The shadows here were dense, illuminated only by a single flickering gas lamp bolted to the brick wall. Malfoy paused before a nondescript, solid wooden door. He pressed his bare palm flat against the brass plate beside the frame. The metal flared with a brief, icy blue luminescence, reading his magical signature, before the heavy internal deadbolts tumbled backward with a series of loud metallic clicks. He pushed the door ajar and stepped backward, pressing his shoulders against the wall to yield the entrance. It was a subtle surrender of space, a stark physical contrast to the arrogant, space-consuming presence he had weaponized in their youth. He gestured toward the dark interior with a slight tilt of his head, his pale eyes heavily shadowed and unreadable. Hermione swallowed hard, the muscles in her throat tight with anxiety, and crossed the threshold. As she stepped onto the hardwood floor, a wave of ambient heat washed over her. It was so intense and absolute after the biting storm that it drew an involuntary, shuddering gasp from her blue lips. A charmed fire blazed quietly in a modest, soot-stained brick hearth, casting a low, flickering amber glow across the room. She stood rigidly in the small entryway, her eyes darting across the shadows, cataloguing the environment with the trained, hyper-vigilant paranoia of an aura's liaison. A part of her expected the suffocating opulence of pure-blood elitism. Heavy velvet drapes choking the windows, dark artifacts humming with malevolence, oil portraits of sneering ancestors tracking her every movement. Instead, she found a stark, uncompromising neutrality. The walls were painted a muted slate grey, entirely bare of decoration. The furniture was purely functional and heavily worn. A solitary, dark leather armchair was positioned too close to the fire, its surface cracked and mapped with use. A heavy oak desk stood in the corner, overwhelmed by uneven, towering stacks of books and loose parchment. A small dining table held only a single chair. There was no malice in this room. There was no dark magic vibrating in the floorboards. The air here was dense with a specific, deeply solitary scent profile. The sharp, metallic tang of ozone from recently cast localized spells. The bitter, earthy aroma of dark, over-steeped black tea, and the distinct, dusty tooth of old parchment. Hermione's grip on her wand loosened slightly. The first microscopic crack in her armor appeared as she absorbed the visual evidence of his daily existence. This was not the lair of a dark prince plotting a resurgence. This was the physical manifestation of an exhale. It was a space entirely detached from the crushing, gilded legacy of the Malfoy name. He lived like a normal, profoundly lonely man. Malfoy stepped in behind her, shutting the door. The definitive click of the lock sliding into place caused a sudden spike of static to crackle in the air between them. The external world was entirely locked out. They were sealed in. He moved past her without a word, shedding his ruined trenchcoat. He hung it on a rusted iron hook by the door, the fabric weeping water heavily onto the floorboards. Beneath the coat, he wore a simple, dark, fine-knit jumper and black trousers. The dampness had seeped through the wool, moulding the dark fabric to the lean, sharp lines of his back and shoulders. He dragged a pale, long-fingered hand through his plastered silver hair, pushing it away from his forehead. The gesture was exhausted, entirely stripped of his usual manufactured aristocratic poise. For the first time all evening, Hermione allowed herself to truly look at him, unimpeded by the frantic flashing of aura lights or the blinding horizontal rain. He was significantly thinner than she remembered from their fleeting, hostile glances at the ministry. The sharp planes of his face were hollowed out by a quiet, persistent fatigue. He moved over to the fireplace, crouching down to throw another split log onto the iron grate. The amber light flickered across his profile, illuminating the heavy, bruised shadows beneath his eyes and the tense, rigid line of his jaw. His internal guilt, the ghosts he had mentioned in the alley, were not loudly proclaimed or dramatically confessed. They were etched into the weary slope of his spine and the absolute, oppressive silence he maintained in his home. A violent, uncontrollable shudder racked Hermione's frame. Her teeth snapped together with a sharp, audible click, the sound painfully loud in the quiet flat. The sheer drop in adrenaline, combined with the extreme temperature shift, was sending her body into minor shock. The freezing water clinging to her clothes felt like a layer of ice against her skin. Malfoy froze. He turned his head slowly over his shoulder, his pale eyes tracking over her pathetic, dripping form. She was still clutching the edges of her soaked cloak, a puddle of rainwater expanding ominously on his clean floorboards. She looked like a drowned defensive creature, cornered in a foreign cage, entirely out of her element. "Take that off," he instructed. His voice was entirely devoid of warmth, but it lacked the sneering, cruel edge she had subconsciously braced for. It was merely a pragmatic order born of necessity. "I am fine." Hermione lied instantly. Her chin tipped up in a reflexive display of stubbornness, even as another violent tremor betrayed her words, rattling her shoulders. It was a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of control in an uncontrollable situation. Malfoy stood up, turning fully to face her. The atmospheric pressure in the room thickened instantly, pressing heavily against her eardrums. He didn't mock her lie. "You are turning blue, Granger," he observed quietly, his gaze dropping to her trembling hands before snapping back to her face. "Your Gryffindor pride isn't going to generate enough thermal energy to stave off hypothermia. Take the cloak off before you flood my hallway." He didn't wait for her to argue. He walked past her, giving her a wide berth, deliberately avoiding any physical proximity. He disappeared down a short, dark hallway, leaving her alone in the living room. Hermione swallowed the metallic taste of anxiety pooling on her tongue. Her fingers, stiff and entirely numb, fumbled uselessly with the intricate metal clasp of her cloak. It took 3 agonizing attempts to undo the heavy hook. She let the saturated garment fall to the floor with a heavy, wet slap. Underneath, her ministry-issued blouse and wool skirt were completely soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to her skin, offering absolutely zero protection against the lingering chill deep in her bones. She wrapped her arms tightly around her torso, trying to suppress the shivers, feeling intensely exposed and vulnerable standing in the center of his private space. The floorboards creaked, and Malfoy reappeared from the hallway. He was carrying a folded bundle of fabric. He stopped 3 feet away, respecting the invisible, highly charged boundary line she had drawn defensively around herself. "The bathroom is through there. First door on the left," he said, holding the clothes out toward her. His eyes remained fixed on a point just over her left shoulder, deliberately avoiding looking at the way her wet clothes clung to her. "There are localized drying charms placed on the iron towel rack. You can hang your uniform there." Hermione hesitated. Taking his clothes meant accepting a level of intimacy that made her stomach twist with a complicated nervous static. It was an admission of need, a physical lowering of her heavily fortified barriers. She looked from his averted face down to the bundle in his hands. It consisted of a thick, dark green wool sweater and a pair of soft, grey cotton trousers. Her eyes drifted back up, catching the subtle, betraying tightening of his grip on the fabric. His knuckles were bone white, the heavy silver ring on his index finger biting deeply into his flesh. He was incredibly uncomfortable too, she realized with a sudden jolt of clarity. This forced proximity, this domestic intimacy, was equally jarring for him. The arrogant boy who would have relentlessly mocked her humiliation was gone, replaced by this guarded, weary man offering a silent, highly tense truce. Slowly, her hands trembling, she reached out. As she took the heavy wool garments from his grasp, her frozen fingertips inadvertently brushed the warm, dry skin of his knuckles. The tactile friction was electric. It was not a gentle spark of warmth, but a sudden, sharp shock of raw awareness that flared up her arm and lodged firmly in her chest. Malfoy's breath hitched, a microscopic, involuntary intake of air. He released the clothing instantly, withdrawing his hand as if her freezing skin had scorched him. His jaw locked so tightly she could see the muscle ticking beneath his pale skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling hearth. He did not reply. He took a sharp step backward, instantly re-establishing a safe, insurmountable distance between them. His silver eyes flashed with a sudden, fiercely guarded intensity as they finally met hers for a fraction of a second before darting away. The approach had abruptly transformed into a defensive repulsion. He turned his back to her, directing his attention rigidly back to the fire, deliberately and entirely cutting off the connection. The sudden, sheer coldness of his silent dismissal stung, a sharp, unpleasant contrast to the brief moment of shared vulnerability. Hermione clutched the dry, soft wool tightly to her chest, the rich scent of cedar and dark bergamot rising from the weave and filling her senses. She turned on her heel and walked quickly toward the hallway, the hollow echo of her footsteps loudly broadcasting her retreat, leaving him standing rigidly alone in the amber shadows. The lock on the bathroom door engaged with a sharp, echoing snap, severing the heavy, charged silence of the flat. Alone in the stark, brightly lit space, Hermione finally allowed the last remnants of her adrenaline to bleed out. Her knees buckled fractionally, a delayed physical reaction to the biting cold and the surreal nature of her current predicament. She leaned back against the solid wood of the door, her breath leaving her lungs in a shaky, white mist. The bathroom was as meticulously devoid of personality as the living room. White subway tiles lined the walls, gleaming under the harsh light of a single glass sconce. The only source of warmth emanated from the heavy iron towel rack bolted beside the porcelain basin. It hummed with a low, constant vibration of ambient magic, radiating a localized, intensely dry heat. With fingers that were stiff and clumsy, Hermione began the arduous task of peeling the saturated layers of her ministry uniform from her shivering skin. The wet wool of her skirt dragged heavily, and her blouse clung to her arms like a second icy skin. As each ruined garment fell to the tiled floor with a dismal splash, the biting cold of the room snapped at her bare flesh, bringing out a fresh cascade of violent tremors. She wrung the excess water from her heavy, unruly curls, watching the dark rivulets spiral down the brass drain of the sink, before finally turning her attention to the folded bundle of clothing he had surrendered. She reached for the dark green sweater first. As she pulled the thick wool over her head, it was an immediate, visceral shock to her senses. The garment was impossibly heavy, a dense, high-quality weave that instantly trapped her dissipating body heat and multiplied it. But it was the scent that paralyzed her. It was not merely the smell of clean laundry, it was the distilled, undeniable essence of Draco Malfoy. A deeply ingrained tapestry of sharp cedar, bitter bergamot, the crisp tooth of old parchment, and the lingering, shadowy trace of stale smoke. It flooded her respiratory system, wrapping around her with an aggressive intimacy that made her stomach twist in a sudden, complicated knot. The sweater swallowed her frame entirely. The hem cascaded well past her hips, and the heavy sleeves extended inches beyond her fingertips, rendering her hands useless. She reached for the grey cotton trousers, pulling them up and tying the drawstring as tightly as it would go to keep them anchored to her waist. She stood before the fogged mirror, wiping away a small circle of condensation to look at her reflection. She looked absurd. She looked entirely engulfed by him. A frantic, sudden need for control seized her. She began folding the thick wool cuffs back up her forearms in a rapid, repetitive motion, adjusting and readjusting the fabric until her wrists were finally free. The vulnerability of wearing his clothes, of carrying his scent directly against her skin, felt dangerously akin to lowering her wand in the middle of a duel. Taking a deep, steadying breath that tasted of his soap and ozone, she unlocked the door and stepped out into the short hallway. The hardwood floor was shockingly cold against her bare feet, the hollow echo of her cautious footsteps announcing her return before she even crossed the threshold of the living room. Malfoy was standing by a narrow mahogany side cabinet on the far side of the room, his back partially turned to the hallway. A heavy, square glass decanter of amber liquid sat open on the polished wood beside two crystal tumblers. The firelight danced across the sharp, tense line of his shoulders. He was in the middle of pouring a measure of fire whiskey, the liquid splashing softly against the crystal. He heard the floorboards groan beneath her weight and turned. The movement was initially fluid, but the moment his pale eyes registered her standing in the archway, he froze entirely. It was a jarring impact that seemed to violently compress the air in the room. The heavy crystal stopper in his right hand hovered suspended an inch above the neck of the decanter. His gaze swept over her, a dark, consuming sweep that took in the oversized drape of the dark green wool against her pale, shivering skin, the rolled-up sleeves, and the damp, chaotic tangle of her hair resting against the collar. A sharp, completely unguarded exhale ripped through his teeth, loud in the suffocating quiet of the flat. The tendons in his neck pulled taut, rigid as piano wire. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed mask of the weary, detached exile fractured completely, revealing a raw, terrifyingly intense hunger that pinned Hermione to the spot. The tactile friction in the room skyrocketed, making the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end beneath the heavy wool. He looked physically struck by the sight of her wrapped in his possessions. Then, just as quickly as the fracture appeared, a heavy, invisible iron gate slammed shut behind his eyes. The transition was violent in its speed. Malfoy blinked, his jaw locking so severely that the muscle ticked furiously beneath his hollowed cheekbone. The knuckles of his left hand, resting flat against the edge of the mahogany cabinet, bleached instantly bone white as he gripped the wood like a lifeline. He was terrified by his own reaction, and his immediate, desperate defense was to manufacture an impenetrable glacier between them. He slammed the crystal stopper back into the decanter with unnecessary force. The sharp clink of glass on glass shattered the heavy static in the air. "I took the liberty of pouring a medicinal dose," he drawled. The weary, grounded baritone from the alleyway was completely eradicated. In its place was the smooth, icy, polished cadence of the Malfoy air, a tone of absolute, cruel indifference that she had not heard in years. It sent a fresh, decidedly different type of chill racing down her spine. He picked up one of the tumblers, deliberately avoiding looking at her face. He moved with rigid, mechanical precision, crossing to the heavy oak desk and placing the glass on its extreme outer edge. He did not step toward her. He did not offer it to her hand. Instead, He retreated behind the cracked leather armchair, using the bulky furniture as a physical barricade, putting as much geographical distance between them as the small living room would allow. To stave off the chill, he added, his voice devoid of any inflection. He raised his own glass, his silver eyes fixed firmly on the dancing flames in the hearth, resolutely refusing to acknowledge her presence any further. He took a slow, measured swallow of the amber liquid, the picture of aristocratic detachment. The sudden, sheer drop in emotional temperature was a physical blow. A moment ago, the room had hummed with a strange, hesitant truce, a shared vulnerability born of the storm. Now, the atmospheric pressure was thin, brittle, and hostile. Hermione felt a sudden, burning flush of humiliation crawl up her neck. The warmth of the dark green sweater suddenly felt suffocating, less like a protective shelter and more like a foolish mistake. The approach had been forcefully, brutally repelled. She had allowed herself to forget, even for 20 minutes, exactly who she was dealing with. He was still Draco Malfoy, and the sight of her in his clothes was clearly repugnant enough to send him retreating behind his oldest, most toxic armor. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to let him see the sting of his withdrawal. Her spine stiffened into a rigid, defensive line. She did not speak. She simply walked across the room, her bare feet silent on the rug, and picked up the glass from the edge of the desk. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the cool, heavy crystal, anchoring herself against the bitter, freezing silence he had just deliberately dumped into the room. The heavy crystal tumbler felt like a block of ice against Hermione's sensitized palm, a stark contrast to the boiling indignation rapidly rising in her chest. She stood at the edge of the dark mahogany desk, her bare feet planted firmly on the worn rug. She refused to retreat. Let him cower behind his battered leather armchair. Let him build his invisible, glacial walls of aristocratic indifference. She was entirely too exhausted to play the victim in his sudden, inexplicable withdrawal. Without breaking her gaze from the rigid, defensive line of his back, she raised the glass to her lips and swallowed the fire whiskey neat. The alcohol hit the back of her throat with the sharp, violent bite of a stinging hex. It dragged a trail of pure, unadulterated heat down her esophagus, hitting her empty stomach and radiating outward in a rapid, blooming wave. The violent tremors that had plagued her frame finally began to subside, replaced by a heavy, languid warmth that slowly loosened the tight, anxious knot at the base of her skull. She exhaled a long, ragged breath. The sound was immediately swallowed by the aggressive percussion of the storm, violently assaulting the single window pane in the living room. The rain did not merely fall. It threw itself against the glass in heavy, chaotic sheets, a relentless, roaring reminder of the hostile world locked outside. Hermione turned her back on him. It was a deliberate, calculated dismissal. She walked slowly toward the hearth, the soft, heavy wool of his oversized sweater brushing gently against her thighs. She sank onto the faded Persian rug directly in front of the grate, crossing her legs and leaning toward the dancing amber flames. The ambient magic of the fire kissed her damp, chaotic curls, drawing out the faint scent of rainwater, ozone, and his dark bergamot soap. For a long time, the only sounds occupying the flat were the howling wind, the sharp crackle of the burning logs, and the subtle, rhythmic clinking of ice against crystal as Draco stood frozen in his self-imposed exile across the room. The hostility stretching between them required an immense, constant output of energy to sustain, and Hermione simply did not have the reserves. She rested her elbows on her knees, cradling the heavy crystal in both hands, staring intently into the mesmerizing orange core of the fire. The profound quiet of the flat pressed inward. It was a dense, heavy static that felt entirely alien to the chaotic, heavily populated and perpetually urgent world she inhabited at the ministry. She listened to the floorboards. She mapped his subtle movements without looking. He shifted his weight. The leather of the armchair creaked faintly as his knuckles brushed against the cracked upholstery. The oppressive atmospheric pressure in the room began to fray at the edges, the biting manufactured hostility slowly dissolving under the weight of something far more dangerous, a crushing, mutual exhaustion. A heavy sigh, completely devoid of pure-blood pretense, slipped past his lips. It was the sound of a man surrendering his shield because his arm was simply too tired to hold it up any longer. Slowly, the floorboards groaned in a steady, measured cadence. He was abandoning his barricade. Hermione did not turn her head, but every nerve ending in her body leaped to sudden, agonizing attention. She tracked his approach through the shifting, elongated shadows cast upon the brick hearth. He did not return to the mahogany cabinet. He did not retreat to the dark isolation of the hallway. Instead, he moved cautiously into her periphery, his tall frame blocking a fraction of the ambient light, before he sank slowly into the dark leather armchair positioned beside the fire, mere feet away from where she sat on the rug. The proximity was an immediate, jarring impact on her senses. The rich, bitter scent of him intensified, wrapping around her with a renewed, dizzying intimacy that made her pulse flutter wildly against her throat. He rested his elbows on his knees, mirroring her posture, his long, pale fingers loosely interlaced between them. The glass of fire whiskey dangled precariously from his right hand. The flickering light illuminated the hollows of his cheeks and the dark, bruised exhaustion beneath his silver eyes. He stared into the flames, his profile entirely slack, the cruel mask of indifference completely stripped away, leaving only a striking, terrible vulnerability. "The wards won't drop until dawn," he murmured. His rough baritone was stripped of all its previous sharp defensive edges. It was quiet, grounded, and intensely weary. It was not a taunt. It was a quiet offering of reality. Hermione traced the rim of her empty tumbler with her thumb, the friction soothing her racing mind. "I know. The magical law enforcement patrols will be stretched dangerously thin," he continued, his voice a low vibration that resonated over the crackling logs, carrying a strange hypnotic cadence. "They will seal the perimeter and wait for the curse breakers to clear the rubble at first light. There is no strategic advantage to attempting a breach in the dark. You sound remarkably well versed in Ministry tactical protocol, Malfoy." The words slipped out before she could temper them, a reflex born of old habits and interrogations, but they lacked the venomous bite of accusation. They were merely an observation. A ghost of a humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. He did not look at her. "When your continued existence in polite society depends entirely on navigating a labyrinth of parole restrictions, random wand weighings, and aura checkpoints, You tend to memorize the patrol schedules, Granger. Survival dictates observation. The raw honesty of the statement hung suspended in the heavy static between them. There was no melodrama in his tone, no plea for absolution. It was merely a bleak, factual recounting of his daily reality. Hermione turned her head slightly, studying the tense line of his jaw and the way his left hand subconsciously drifted to massage his right wrist. A nervous, grounding tick that betrayed his outward stillness, his thumb pressing hard into the skin where his pulse beat frantically. "Is that why you live here?" she asked softly, the defensive walls crumbling completely under the weight of her intense, undeniable curiosity. "To observe without being seen?" Draco finally turned his head. The silver of his eyes caught the firelight, burning with a sudden, localized intensity. The magnetic pull between them snapped taut, instantly erasing the geographical distance of the few feet that separated his chair from her spot on the rug. "I live here because the silence is manageable," he answered, his gaze locking onto hers with a fierce, uncompromising clarity. "In Wiltshire, the walls scream. Here, it is just the rain." He held her stare. For the first time in their entire, fractured history, Hermione did not see the sneering boy who had terrorized her in the corridors of Hogwarts, nor the terrifying phantom of a broken regime. She saw a man entirely hollowed out by his own choices, desperately clinging to a quiet, anonymous existence in a damp, muggle-adjacent alley. She understood exactly what he meant, without him needing to articulate the horrors. She had bled on those manor floors. But to realize that the phantom agony of that house haunted him as violently as it haunted her victims, that the opulence he was raised to revere had become a psychological prison he had to flee, shattered the last remnants of her binary view of the war. He was not a victor resting on dark laurels. He was a casualty nursing an incurable, silent wound. The sheer weight of that realization pressed against her ribs, making her heart ache with a strange, foreign empathy she had never thought possible to extend to Draco Malfoy. The tumbler in her hands was empty. Draco noticed the subtle shift in her grip, his eyes dropping to the crystal. Without breaking eye contact, he reached out with his free hand, lifting the heavy, square glass decanter he had brought over from the cabinet. He leaned forward, slipping off the edge of the leather cushion, closing the final invisible gap between them. Hermione instinctively held her glass out to meet him. As he tilted the heavy crystal to pour the amber liquid, the back of his knuckles brushed against the soft, sensitive skin of her inner wrist. The tactile friction was instantaneous and paralyzing. The breath stalled completely in Hermione's lungs. A sharp, electric tremor shot up her arm, radiating directly into the center of her chest. It was not the hostile, repulsive shock from the hallway. This was a deep, visceral alignment, a sudden, agonizing awareness of his heat, his proximity, and the terrifying fragility of the boundary they had just crossed. Draco froze. The fire whiskey splashed heavily into her glass, the scent of the alcohol blooming sharply in the air, but he did not pull his hand away. He remained leaning forward, suspended in the agonizing tension of the physical contact. His pale eyes widened fractionally, the silver darkening to a stormy grey as his gaze dropped from her eyes to the point where his warm skin rested flush against hers. The muscle in his jaw ticked furiously. He was breathing through his teeth, short, shallow intakes of air that betrayed the monumental internal battle raging beneath his ribs. The atmospheric pressure in the small room was suddenly too thick to inhale. Every ingrained survival instinct screamed at Hermione to withdraw, to preserve her safety, to re-establish the familiar, hostile distance that had defined their lives. Instead, her fingers tightened around the crystal, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her sternum, and she kept her hand perfectly, terrifyingly still. The silence that followed the spill of fire whiskey was not empty. It was a pressurized chamber, straining against the rhythmic, violent thrumming of the rain against the window pane. Draco did not pull his hand away. The back of his knuckles remained pressed against the pulse point of Hermione's inner wrist, a searing brand of skin-on-skin contact that seemed to hum with a low-voltage current. She could feel the erratic, frantic skip of her own heart beneath his touch, a rhythmic confession she was powerless to retract. The amber liquid in her glass trembled, reflecting the flickering hearthfire in 1,000 fractured shards of light. Draco's gaze was fixed on that point of contact, his silver eyes dark and clouded with a turbulent internal war. His breathing was a series of sharp, jagged intakes that mirrored the static electricity crackling in the air. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing caution that felt like a surrender, his fingers uncurled. His thumb, rough-hewn and calloused from years of gripping a wand in high-stress duels, traced a slow, scorching arc across the sensitive tendons of her wrist. The tactile friction was a physical blow. Hermione's breath hitched, a soft, involuntary sound that seemed to shatter the last of his composure. "Granger," he whispered. Her name was not a taunt or a greeting. It was a bruised, desperate exhale, a plea for a boundary he no longer had the strength to maintain. He looked up then, and the raw vulnerability in his expression was a jarring impact. The carefully maintained mask of the stoic, reformed exile had disintegrated, leaving behind the jagged remains of a man who was profoundly, dangerously lonely. The magnetic pull between them, nurtured by years of obsessed observation from opposite sides of a battlefield, suddenly snapped taut, dragging them into a shared, terrifying orbit. Hermione's fingers tightened around the heavy crystal tumbler until her own knuckles were as white as his. She should pull away. Every scrap of logic, every hard-won principle of her post-war life dictated that she should re-establish the distance. But the heat of his skin was an anchor, the only solid thing in a world that had become a fluid, chaotic storm. She found herself leaning into the contact, her thumb reflexively brushing the edge of his silver ring. The cold, hard bite of the metal a grounding contrast to the feverish warmth of his hand. The shift happened in the space of a single heartbeat. "Is this why you brought me here, Malfoy?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling vibration. She wasn't accusing him of a trap. She was questioning the sudden, terrifying gravity of the moment. To see if the ghosts would finally stop screaming if you were near someone who survived them. The words acted like a bucket of icy water thrown onto a grease fire. Draco flinched, as if she had struck him with a physical hex. The tenderness in his thumb vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid, bone-deep tension. He didn't just withdraw his hand. He recoiled, his body jerking backward as he scrambled to regain his seat in the leather armchair. The heavy glass decanter clattered against the floorboards, narrowly missing the rug, the remaining liquid sloshing violently inside. The warmth was gone. In its place was a sudden, predatory chill that made the hair on Hermione's neck stand on end. "Don't!" he spat, the word laced with a sudden, jagged venom. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the fire with an expression of such profound, self-loathing intensity that it made her stomach turn. "Don't analyze me, Granger. Don't turn me into one of your ministry case files. You don't get to walk into my home and pretend you understand the weight of the air I breathe." The approach had been violently repelled. The warmth they had briefly shared was incinerated by the sudden flare-up of his defensive guilt. "I wasn't analyzing you," she countered, her own voice rising as the sting of his rejection ignited her dormant temper. She stood up from the rug, the oversized sweater bunching around her hips. She felt ridiculous and exposed, a feeling she channeled into a sharp, focused indignation. "I was trying to acknowledge that we are both standing in the same wreckage, but you're so addicted to your own martyrdom that you'd rather freeze than admit you're human." Draco's laugh was a short, barked sound, sharp and entirely devoid of mirth. He stood up, towering over her, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow across the hearth. The atmospheric pressure in the room surged, thick and suffocating. "Human?" he sneered, the polished, aristocratic cadence returning to his voice, though it was frayed at the edges. "Is that what you call it? I am a man who has to register his wand every 14 days. I am a man whose name is synonymous with the rot in this world's foundation. You are the brightest witch of her age, the golden girl, the saint of the Reconstruction. There is no same wreckage. There is only your pity and my reality." He took a step toward her, encroaching on her personal space with a sudden, aggressive proximity. The scent of him, cedar, bergamot, and the sharp tang of the fire whiskey, was overwhelming. "You think because you're wearing my sweater and drinking my scotch that the past is negotiable? You think a rainy night cancels out the fact that I watched you scream on my floor?" The mention of the manor was a visceral blow to the solar plexus. Hermione's breath left her in a quiet whoosh. The ghost of the pain in her arm, the phantom itch of the scar he hadn't carved but had allowed to happen, flared with a dull, throbbing heat. "I know exactly what happened, Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than his shout. She used his first name as a weapon, a way to strip him of his titles and his defenses. "I remember the look in your eyes that day. You weren't a villain. You were a coward. And right now, standing in this room, you're being a coward again. You're terrified that if you let me be anything other than a memory of your guilt, you'll have to figure out who you are without the shame." The silence that followed was brittle. Draco's jaw worked, the muscle ticking with a frantic, repetitive rhythm. His knuckles were white as he gripped the back of the leather chair, the leather groaning under the strain. For a moment, she thought he might order her out into the storm, that the repulsion would be final. His eyes searched hers, looking for a lie, looking for the pity he so clearly loathed. But he found only the steady, unblinking honesty of a woman who had seen the worst of him and was still standing in front of him, wrapped in his wool and smelling of his life. The anger seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. He didn't move away, but the aggression vanished from his stance. He looked down at his hand, the one that had touched her wrist, as if it belonged to someone else. "I can't be near you, Granger," he murmured, his voice breaking on the final syllable. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession of absolute defeat. "Every time I look at you, I see the version of myself I hate the most. And tonight, I keep forgetting to hate him." He turned away then, walking toward the window where the rain continued its relentless assault. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, his shoulders slumped, his back a map of unresolved conflict. The betrayal of the moment was internal. Hermione felt the doubt creeping in, a cold, oily slick in her mind. Was she being foolish? Was this just the proximity and the trauma of the night playing tricks on her empathy? She looked at the empty glass in her hand, and then at the broken man by the window. The seesaw of their dynamic had swung back toward a frigid, isolated distance. The warmth of the fire seemed to have vanished, leaving the room feeling vast and empty despite its small size. She stood in the center of the rug, the dark green wool of his sweater feeling like a heavy, ill-fitting penance. She wanted to go to him, to place a hand on the sharp line of his shoulder and bridge the gap, but the coldness of his retreat was an invisible wall. He had retreated into his guilt like a shell, and she was left standing in the fallout of their brief electric collision. The rain hammered on, a deafening white noise that filled the void between them. Hermione sat back down on the rug, pulling her knees to her chest and tucking her hands into the long sleeves of the sweater. She stared at the dying embers, her heart heavy with the realization that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging in the quiet, shadowed corners of the room. They were trapped together, two ghosts of a war that refused to end, waiting for a dawn that felt a lifetime away. The rhythmic lash of the rain against the glass had transitioned from a violent assault to a steady, hypnotic drone, a wall of white noise that seemed to shrink the universe down to the four walls of this dimly lit room. The fire had settled into a deep, pulsating orange glow, the initial roar of the logs replaced by the occasional sharp pop of sap and the soft hiss of white ash collapsing in on itself. Draco remained at the window, a dark silhouette against the weeping glass. He had not moved for nearly an hour. The tension in his shoulders had not dissipated. It had merely fossilized, turning him into a statue of rigid, silent penance. The back of his neck, pale and vulnerable in the low light, seemed to vibrate with the sheer effort of his restraint. Hermione sat on the rug, her back against the side of the leather armchair. She had tucked her feet beneath the heavy hem of the dark green sweater, her hands hidden deep within the sleeves. She watched the way the firelight licked at the shadows on the ceiling, her mind a chaotic whirlpool of doubt. Every time she thought she had found a foothold in the shifting sand of his temperament, the ground gave way. The approach was always followed by a brutal repulsion, a cold snap that left her feeling foolish and overexposed. Yet, despite the jagged edges of their argument, she could not bring herself to retreat to the guest room. The atmospheric pressure in the flat was too high. To leave now would be to admit defeat to the ghosts he so desperately clung to. The silence grew so dense, it felt like a physical weight against her eardrums. It was a silence that demanded to be broken, or it would suffocate them both. "You said you moved here because it was quiet," Hermione said softly. Her voice didn't cut through the quiet. drifted into it, hesitant and stripped of its usual clinical authority. "But you're not quiet, Draco. You're just muffled." He didn't turn. For a long moment, she thought he might ignore her entirely, retreating back into the icy armor of his surname. But then, his forehead dropped against the cool pane of the window with a dull, rhythmic thud. "What do you want from me, Granger?" His voice was a hollow rasp, so low it was almost lost to the rain. "Do you want me to tell you that I think about it every day? That the smell of ozone makes my stomach turn because it reminds me of the drawing room? That I can't look at a silver quill without seeing the way the light caught the blade of my aunt's knife?" The raw honesty of the admission made Hermione's heart stutter. It wasn't the scripted self-deprecation she had expected. It was a visceral, tactile catalogue of trauma. "I don't want you to tell me anything," she whispered, standing up slowly. Her bare feet made no sound on the rug as she began to cross the room. "I just wanted to see if there was anything left of the person I used to watch in the library. The one who used to bite the end of his parchment when he was frustrated with an ancient runes translation." Draco stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the windowsill. He finally turned his head, his profile sharp and agonizingly beautiful in the shadows. His silver eyes were wide, startled by the specificity of her memory. "You watched me." "I watched everyone," she countered, though the heat rising in her cheeks betrayed the half-truth. "But you were the most difficult to solve. You were all sharp angles and loud proclamations, but you always looked like you were waiting for someone to catch you in a lie." She stopped 2 paces away from him. The scent of cedar and rain-damped wool was a magnetic pull, an invisible tether drawing her into his personal space. The tactile friction between them was no longer a spark. It was a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated in her very marrow. Draco turned fully to face her, his back against the glass. He looked trapped, a predator cornered by a prey that refused to run. His gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second, a hungry, desperate flicker before snapping back to her eyes. The muscle in his jaw was ticking with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, but he made no move to push her away. He didn't even lift his hands to create a barrier. He just stood there, vibrating with a suppressed energy that made the air feel thin and unbreathable. "The bridge is out, remember?" Hermione took another step. The distance between them was now negligible, a mere breath of air. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a fierce, living warmth that defied the cold glass behind him. The seesaw swung violently toward approach. Hermione reached out, her hand trembling. She didn't go for his face. She reached for his hand, which was still white-knuckled against the wood of the windowsill. Slowly, she slid her fingers over his, the warmth of her skin a jarring impact against his freezing exterior. Draco let out a jagged, broken sound, half sob, half gasp. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, his hand flipped over, his long fingers interlacing with hers in a grip so tight it was almost painful. It was a drowning man's grip, a desperate, visceral alignment that bypassed all logic. "I'm tired, Hermione," he whispered, her first name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. "I'm so goddamn tired of being the only one left in the dark." The vulnerability of the confession shattered the last of her defenses. She didn't think about the war, or the blood, or the years of mutual loathing. She only saw the man in front of her, the broken, silver-eyed ghost who was finally reaching out for a tether. She moved into his space, her chest brushing against the dark wool of his jumper. The contact was electric, a sudden, blinding surge of static that made her head swim. She reached up with her free hand, her fingertips grazing the sharp, stubble-shadowed line of his jaw. Draco's eyes closed, a shudder racking his entire frame. He leaned into her touch, his face pressing into the palm of her hand with a devastating, silent surrender. The atmospheric pressure in the room peaked, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and the raw, unadulterated tension of two people who had spent a decade pretending they didn't see each other. "Then stop fighting," she breathed, her thumb tracing the hollow of his cheek. "Just for tonight. Stop being a Malfoy. Stop being a martyr. Just be here." He opened his eyes, and the stormy grey depths were no longer guarded. They were wide, terrified, and filled with a longing so intense it was physical. He looked at her as if she were the only source of light in a world that had been dark for a very long time. His hand left the windowsill, his arm wrapping around her waist with a sudden, possessive strength. He pulled her flush against him, the oversized green sweater bunching between them. The physical proximity was a jarring, glorious impact. She could feel every line of his lean, hard body, the frantic thud of his heart against her own ribs. The repulsion was gone. The doubt was a distant murmur. There was only the heat, the rain, and the magnetic pull of a connection that had finally become too strong to resist. Draco leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His breath, smelling of fire whiskey and cedar, fanned across her lips. "If I start," he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the realization, "I won't know how to stop. I won't be able to let you walk back across that bridge." "Then don't," Hermione replied, her voice steady and sure. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the damp, silk-soft hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down the final inch. The kiss was not the gentle, hesitant thing of a romance novel. It was a collision. It was the breaking of a dam, a desperate, starving exploration of everything they had denied themselves for years. It tasted of salt, smoke, and a decade of unspoken observations. Draco groaned into her mouth, a low, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He kissed her with a ferocity that spoke of a man who had been starving in a desert and had finally found water. His hands were everywhere, tangled in her hair, pressing into the small of her back, gripping her shoulders as if he were trying to memorize the very feel of her through the thick wool. Hermione met him with equal fervor, her mind finally, blissfully quiet. The show don't tell of his touch was more eloquent than any confession. In the way he held her, in the desperate pressure of his lips, he was telling her everything his guilt had suppressed. He was telling her he was sorry. He was telling her he was hers. They stayed there, anchored to each other against the backdrop of the storm, the dying fire casting long, flickering shadows across their intertwined forms. The internal conflict hadn't vanished, but for the first time, it wasn't the loudest thing in the room. The only thing that mattered was the tactile friction of his skin against hers, and the realization that the bridge to her old life might be broken. But a new one was being built in the quiet, shadowed corners of this flat. The darkness of the flat had deepened into something liquid and velvet, illuminating dominated only by the dying rhythmic pulse of the embers in the hearth. Outside, the storm had finally exhausted its initial rage, settling into a heavy, weeping drizzle that streaked the window pane like tears. The aggressive roar of the wind had faded into a low, mournful sigh, leaving the interior of the room so quiet that the ticking of a clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer against an anvil. They had moved from the window back to the worn leather armchair, but the furniture was no longer a barricade. Draco sat with his back against the side of the chair, his long legs stretched out across the rug, and Hermione was tucked into the space beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. The oversized dark green sweater was a shared shroud, the heavy wool trapping their combined heat until the air between them felt thick and hazy. Draco's hand was tangled in her hair, his fingers moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, tracing the chaotic curls that were finally beginning to dry. The tactile friction was no longer a jarring shock. It was a steady, grounding hum. He was no longer the rigid statue of a penitent. His body had softened, moulding to hers with a desperate, heavy gravity. "You're thinking again," Draco murmured. His voice was a low, granular vibration that resonated through his chest and into her temple. The sharpness was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, unvarnished intimacy. "I can hear the gears grinding, Granger. It's loud." Hermione shifted slightly, her nose brushing the soft wool of his jumper. The scent of him, now inextricably mixed with the smell of her own skin and the fading tang of fire whiskey, was a drug she didn't want to detox from. "I'm just wondering if the bridge is still broken," she whispered. It was a metaphor, and they both knew it. Draco's fingers stilled in her hair. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted, a brief, cold draft of reality blowing through the warmth. The seesaw threatened to tip back toward doubt. The morning was coming, and with it, the ministry patrols, the gossip, the crushing weight of their respective legacies, and the impossibility of a Malfoy and a Granger existing in the same light. "The bridge is rubble," he said, his voice hardening just a fraction. He pulled back slightly, looking down at her. The shadows made the hollows of his eyes look like deep, ink-stained craters. "And even if they fix the stone, the distance is still there. I am still the man who did nothing while you were tortured, and you are still the woman who represents everything I lost." The approach was suddenly threatened by a wave of cold repulsion, not of her, but of the world they inhabited. Hermione sat up, moving to face him on the rug. She reached out, her hands cupping his face, her thumbs smoothing the tense, frantic line of his jaw. The show don't tell of her touch was an anchor. She didn't offer a speech about forgiveness or the future. She simply refused to let him retreat into his shell of guilt. "The distance is only there if we keep walking away from each other," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "I'm not a saint, Draco. I'm tired of being a symbol. I'm tired of being the brightest witch and the war heroine. Tonight, in this room, I'm just a woman who was cold, and you're just a man who gave her a sweater. Why can't that be enough?" Draco stared at her, his silver eyes searching hers for a lie, for a hint of the pity he loathed. He found only a fierce, stubborn desire that mirrored his own. The internal conflict was a visible tremor in his hands as he reached up to cover hers, pressing her palms harder against his cheeks. "Because the world doesn't let things be enough," he whispered. "They will want a pound of flesh from me for even touching you." "Let them try to take it," she countered, a spark of the old Gryffindor fire lighting her eyes. The tension snapped. It wasn't an argument this time. It was an ignition. Draco lunged forward, his mouth finding hers with a sudden, desperate hunger that made her head snap back. It was a kiss of absolute possession, a frantic attempt to shut out the coming dawn. He tasted of salt and smoke, his lips demanding and soft all at once. His hands slid down her neck, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone beneath the heavy wool, his touch a searing brand that left a trail of fire in its wake. Hermione let out a soft, broken moan, her fingers tangling in the silk of his hair, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. The magnetic pull was a physical force now, a gravitational collapse that drew them both into the center of the rug. He laid her back against the soft, faded patterns of the Persian carpet, his body a heavy, protective weight over hers. The fire had sunk to a bed of glowing coals, casting a dim, reddish light that made their skin look like molten gold in the shadows. Draco broke the kiss, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as he buried his face in the crook of her neck. "Stay," he rasped, the word a raw, bleeding confession. "Don't go back across the river when the sun comes up. Stay here, where the world can't find us." The vulnerability of the plea was a visceral impact. Hermione felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye, the first bit of moisture that wasn't rain. She wrapped her arms around his back, her fingers tracing the sharp, elegant lines of his shoulder blades. "I can't stay forever, Draco," she whispered into the dark. "But I'm not leaving yet." The warmth between them intensified, a deep, soul-level alignment that transcended the physical. For hours, they existed in a state of suspended animation, a slow, sensual exploration of silence and touch. There were no more words about the war, no more debates about blood or betrayal. There was only the rhythmic brush of skin against wool, the quiet sigh of their breathing, and the way the light of the dying fire danced across their intertwined fingers. Draco's touch was reverent, almost fearful, as if he expected her to vanish into a cloud of smoke if he pressed too hard. He traced the lines of her palms, the curve of her waist, the small of her back, his movements slow and deliberate, a man memorizing a map of a country he never thought he'd be allowed to visit. Hermione watched him, her heart aching with a strange, fierce protectiveness. She saw the way his eyes softened when he thought she wasn't looking, the way the tension in his jaw finally, mercifully dissolved. He was beautiful in the dark, stripped of his pride and his armor, just a man seeking a sanctuary he had spent his whole life being told he didn't deserve. As the first microscopic hint of grey began to bleed into the edges of the sky outside the window, the seesaw settled into a fragile, precarious balance. The approach was complete. The trust was a thin, shimmering thread, but it was there, anchored in the quiet flat and the scent of cedar. They lay together on the rug, the fire now a heap of silver ash. Draco was curled behind her, his chest a solid warmth against her back, his arm draped heavily over her waist. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a soft, protective blanket. "The rain has stopped," Hermione murmured, looking at the window where the glass was no longer weeping, but merely damp. Draco tightened his grip on her, his face pressing into the back of her head. "I didn't notice." The internal monologue of his guilt was quiet for the first time in years. The atmospheric pressure had equalized. The bridge was still broken, the world was still hostile, and the morning would bring 1,000 complications they weren't ready to face. But as Hermione felt the slow, steady beat of his heart against her spine, she knew that the repulsion was gone for good. The final shift had begun. The warmth was no longer a temporary shelter from a storm. It was the foundation of something that would outlast the rubble of the bridge and the ghosts of the manor. She closed her eyes, letting the scent of him fill her one last time before the light became too bright. And for the first time since the war ended, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The grey, bruised light of dawn did not break through the window. It bled in, a slow and silent intrusion that dismantled the velvet safety of the shadows. The room, which had felt like an expansive, timeless universe during the dark hours of the storm, began to shrink back into its physical dimensions. The outlines of the stacked books, the solitary chair, and the cold hearth reclaimed their sharp, mundane edges. Hermione stirred against the firm warmth of Draco's chest. The oversized green sweater was twisted around her hips, the heavy wool a familiar weight that had become a second skin. As the reality of the morning pressed in, the old instincts, the analytical, defensive machinery of her mind, threatened to whir back into motion. She expected the cold snap. She braced for the repulsion, for the moment Draco would wake, realize the magnitude of the boundaries they had incinerated, and retreat behind a wall of pure-blood ice and jagged self-loathing. She felt his breath hitch against the nape of her neck. His arm, draped heavily over her waist, tightened instinctively rather than pulling away. "Don't," he rasped. His voice was thick with sleep and the raw, unvarnished honesty of the night. "Don't start calculating the exit strategy, Granger. I can feel your brain resetting." Hermione turned in the circle of his arms, her movements slow and cautious. The floorboards groaned beneath them, a grounding domestic sound. She looked up at him. In the unforgiving, flat light of morning, Draco looked stripped bare. The bruised shadows under his eyes were prominent, and the sharp line of his jaw was shadowed with silver stubble. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck, but his silver eyes were clear, fixed on her with a terrifying, steady intensity that lacked any of his previous guardedness. The seesaw hovered, trembling on the edge of a final, permanent shift. "The wards will be down by now," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The bridge. They'll have established a temporary ferry or a portkey station. I have a briefing at 9. Draco's expression didn't flicker. He didn't offer the sneer she had spent years anticipating. Instead, he reached out, his long, pale fingers tracing the line of her cheek, his thumb catching a stray, chaotic curl. The tactile friction was no longer a shock of static. It was a warm, constant current, a visceral alignment of two people who had finally stopped fighting the tide. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. "To walk out that door, put on your armor, and pretend that we are still just ghosts haunting the same hallways?" The internal monologue of Hermione's doubt flared one last time. She thought of the ministry, the whispers, the weight of their names. She thought of the scorched earth of their history. But then she looked at the heavy silver ring on his finger, the one that had bitten into his skin when he was tense, now resting gently against her temple. She smelled the cedar and the fading ozone. "No," she confessed, the word a small tectonic shift. "That's not what I want." Draco's exhale was a long, shuddering release of tension he had likely held for a decade. He sat up, pulling her with him until they were sitting cross-legged on the rug, facing each other in the center of his quiet, independent world. The fire was entirely ash now, but the room didn't feel cold. He reached for her hands, his palms dry and warm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the heavy, expectant silence, he was showing her the choice. He was offering a truce that wasn't built on the war, but on the wreckage they had navigated together through the night. "I don't have a manner to offer you," he said, his voice regaining a hint of its dry, sardonic edge, though it was softened by a newfound vulnerability. "I have a drafty flat, a collection of banned books, and a name that people still spit on. It's a miserable foundation, Hermione." "I've always been good at restoration, Draco," she countered, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The magnetic pull was absolute. The internal conflict that had defined their relationship, the tension between "can't stand it" and "can't help but think," finally collapsed into a singular, undeniable truth. Draco leaned in, his movements no longer frantic or desperate, but slow and deliberate. He paused, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool morning air. He was waiting for her to pull away, to give him one last reason to retreat into the shadows. She didn't. She closed the distance. The kiss was different from the ones in the dark. It wasn't a collision or a drowning man's gasp for air. It was a seal. It was soft, lingering, and tasted of the quiet peace that follows a fever. It was the sound of a door locking against the outside world and a window opening to let in the light. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright, the stormy grey replaced by a clear, shimmering silver. He looked younger, the weight of the Malfoy legacy finally sliding off his shoulders. "Stay for breakfast," he murmured, his fingers tangling with hers. "The flue is probably still blocked, and the bridge is definitely still a mess. Let the ministry wait. Let the world wonder where the golden girl went." Hermione looked at the door, then back at the man who had given her his sweater, his scotch, and his secrets. The bridge to her old, lonely life was indeed broken, and she found she had no desire to see it repaired. "I think I'd like some tea," she said. The resolution was quiet but absolute. Draco stood, pulling her up with him. He didn't let go of her hand as he led her toward the small, functional kitchen. The atmospheric pressure in the flat had equalized into something stable and warm. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant golden light over the damp streets of London. The rain had washed everything clean. The soot, the grime, and the lingering scent of the blast. As they stood together in the small kitchen, the steam from the kettle rising in soft white plumes, Draco pulled her back against his chest. He pressed a final, lingering kiss to the top of her head, his arms wrapping around her in a protective, permanent embrace. The storm had brought them together, but it was the quiet of the morning that would keep them there. They were no longer enemies, no longer victims, and no longer just survivors. They were a man and a woman in a small flat, starting over in the wreckage, finally warm, finally home. The hallway of the tenement building was a narrow, dim wind tunnel that smelled of damp stone, and the sharp, lingering sting of the night's magic. As the heavy wooden door of Draco's flat clicked shut behind them, the sound vibrated through Hermione's chest like a gavel. Inside that room, time had been a fluid, golden thing, a suspension of reality where they were merely two souls seeking friction to stave off the frost. Out here, the air was thin and clinical, the morning light slicing through the high, grime-streaked windows of the stairwell with the precision of a scalpel. Draco walked a half-step ahead of her, his posture having returned to a rigid, defensive verticality. He had traded the soft, borrowed wool sweater back for his own clothes, his charcoal trench coat now dry but stiff, the collar turned up against a wind that had long since died down. The silver ring on his finger caught the pale sun, flashing a warning with every rhythmic movement of his hand. He didn't look back as they descended the stairs. The seesaw of their dynamic, which had felt so balanced in the warmth of the hearth, was now tipping toward a frigid, familiar repulsion. It wasn't that he was angry, it was that he was preparing to be hated again. He was stepping back into the role the world demanded of him, the pariah, the shadow, and by extension, he was trying to push her back into hers. They reached the street level and stepped out into the biting clarity of a London morning after a deluge. The pavement was a dark, glistening slate, the gutters still gurgling with the runoff of the storm. The air was unnervingly quiet, save for the distant, rhythmic thud of Ministry construction charms echoing from the riverbank. As they turned the corner toward the temporary Portkey station established near the ruins of the bridge, the atmospheric pressure changed. It wasn't magic this time. It was the weight of human observation. A perimeter had been established. Gold-threaded aura tape shimmered in the air, cordoning off the jagged gap where the stone had once arched over the Thames. A crowd had gathered. Displaced wizards in singed robes, harried ministry officials with rolls of parchment, and a cluster of journalists from the Daily Prophet, their quick quotes quills hovering like expectant vultures. The moment they crossed into the line of sight of the crowd, the ambient noise of the street died a sudden, violent death. It was a visceral impact. Hermione felt the collective intake of breath from a dozen strangers as a physical blow to her sternum. The Golden Girl, the saint of the Reconstruction, was walking out of a shadowed side street, her hair a wild, damp thicket, wearing the same clothes she'd worn to work 18 hours ago, side by side with the air of Malfoy Manor. The whispers began as a low-frequency hum, a tectonic grinding of shock and immediate judgment. Is that? With him. Look at her cloak. It's his coat she's near. Draco flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the muscles in his jaw that only someone who had spent the night studying his every breath would notice. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes fixed on the gold tape ahead, his face a mask of such profound, icy detachment that he looked like a statue of himself. Then he did exactly what Hermione feared he would do. He slowed his pace, creating a deliberate, widening gap between them. It was a tactical retreat, a silent attempt to sever the visual connection before the cameras could capture the truth of their proximity. He was trying to give her back her reputation by sacrificing his own right to stand beside her. The repulsion was an act of misguided mercy. Hermione felt a flash of white-hot indignation. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the strap of her bag. The internal monologue of her pride roared to life, but it was drowned out by a much louder, much more desperate need for the warmth she had found in the dark. She didn't let the gap widen. Instead, she lunged forward, her boots clicking sharply against the wet pavement. In full view of the Aura Guard, the journalists and the gaping public, Hermione reached out and caught his hand. The tactile friction was a lightning strike. Draco's hand was freezing, his fingers rigid with the effort of holding himself together. When her palm pressed against his, he didn't join the contact immediately. He recoiled, his hand jerking as if she had burned him. "Granger, don't," he hissed, his voice a low, jagged rasp that barely carried past his own collar. He still wouldn't look at her, but his chest was heaving with the force of his suppressed panic. "Think about what you're doing. Look at them." "I am looking at you, Draco," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the nearest cluster of onlookers. She didn't just hold his hand. She interlaced her fingers with his, forcing his stiff, pale digits to yield to her warmth. She felt the heavy silver of his ring bite into her skin, a grounding metallic anchor. The magnetic pull between them, which had been a private secret for 10 hours, was now a public declaration. The cameras flashed, a series of blinding, aggressive white bursts that left violet spots in her vision. The journalists descended like a swarm of insects, their quills scratching frantically against parchment. "Miss Granger, a comment on the bridge explosion?" "Mr. Malfoy, are you under investigation for the breach? How long has this association been active?" The atmospheric pressure was suffocating. The crowd pressed inward, a wall of suspicion and demand. Hermione felt Draco's grip falter, his thumb twitching against her wrist as his internal guilt began to scream that he was ruining her, that he was the rot they were all looking for. She squeezed his hand, her nails digging slightly into the back of his knuckles. She leaned into him, her shoulder brushing the heavy wool of his coat, re-establishing the physical alignment they had found on the rug. "We were trapped on the same side of the river." Hermione addressed the crowd, her voice the polished, impenetrable steel of the department head she was destined to become. "Mr. Malfoy provided me with shelter during the ministry-mandated lockdown. If there are questions regarding the investigation, you may direct them to my office at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't grant them the satisfaction of a blush or a stammer. She tugged on Draco's hand, leading him toward the Chief Aura standing at the portkey station. The man, a grizzled veteran named Proudfoot, looked from their joined hands to Hermione's face, his expression a complicated map of confusion and professional wariness. "Granger," he nodded slowly, his eyes flickering to Draco with an undisguised edge of hostility. "Malfoy, we didn't expect to see you appearing together." "The bridge is broken, Proudfoot," Hermione said, her tone clipped and final. "We are simply navigating the detour. Are the port keys to Whitehall active?" Proudfoot hesitated, his hand hovering over a rusted old kettle that served as the transport. The silence of the crowd was absolute, a heavy, expectant static. In that moment, Draco finally looked at her. He didn't look at the cameras or the auras. He looked at Hermione. The silver of his eyes was no longer guarded. It was wide, terrified, and filled with a profound, shattering realization. He saw that she wasn't ashamed. He saw that she had chosen the wreckage with him over the safety of the shore. The seesaw slammed down on the side of trust. His fingers, which had been limp and resistant, suddenly tightened around hers. He didn't just accept the contact, he claimed it. He stepped forward, his tall frame shielding her from the nearest photographer, his jaw setting into a line of such fierce, uncompromising protection that it silenced the murmurs in his immediate vicinity. "The kettle leaves in 10 seconds, Proudfoot muttered, stepping aside. Draco reached out with his free hand, his fingers brushing the handle of the portkey. He waited for Hermione to do the same. In the fraction of a second before the magic took hold, he leaned down, his lips ghosting against the shell of her ear. "You're a fool, Hermione Granger," he whispered, the words a jagged, beautiful confession. "Perhaps," she breathed back, her eyes locked on his, "but I'm a warm fool." The blue glow of the portkey ignited, a sudden, violent surge of magic that pulled at their navels. The world of the riverbank, the cameras, the whispers, the shattered stone, dissolved into a spinning vortex of light and sound. But as they were dragged through the ether, Hermione didn't feel the usual nausea of magical travel. She only felt the crushing, solid reality of his hand in hers, the heavy silver of his ring pressing into her palm, and the knowledge that while the bridge was gone, they had finally found the path across. The London skyline was a jagged silhouette of charcoal and violet, the sun having dipped beneath the horizon to leave only a bruised, ethereal glow behind the skeletal crane arms of the Ministry reconstruction crews. 3 weeks had passed since the night the sky fell, and the bridge, once a smoking chasm of hissing rubble, was nearly whole again. Its new stones were pale and unweathered, a bright scar of progress against the ancient, soot-stained masonry of the riverbank. Hermione stood at the iron railing of the pedestrian walkway, the evening wind tugging at the stray, unruly curls that escaped her knitted scarf. The air no longer tasted of ozone and copper. It smelled of the river, of roasting chestnuts from a nearby Muggle street vendor, and the crisp, clean bite of early winter. She wasn't wearing her ministry uniform. She had traded the stiff charcoal wool for a soft, cream-coloured coat and a pair of sturdy boots. In her arms, she cradled a small terracotta pot. Inside it, a silver-leafed moonfern, a plant known for thriving in the deepest shadows and blooming only when the world was quiet, shook its delicate fronds in the breeze. The atmospheric pressure of the city had shifted. The scandal of the Golden Girl and the Death Eater had not vanished, but it had settled into a low, manageable hum, much like the background noise of the Thames itself. There had been howlers, yes. There had been icy silences in the ministry lift, and a particularly scathing editorial in the Prophet regarding misguided wartime sympathies. But the seesaw of public opinion mattered less and less with every passing day. The only internal monologue that played in Hermione's head now was a steady, rhythmic pulse of anticipation. She turned away from the river and began the familiar walk toward the narrow, shadowed alley. The tenement building looked exactly the same. Weathered stone, rusted iron knocker, and the heavy oak door that smelled of ancient magic and cedar. But as Hermione reached the threshold, she didn't hesitate. She didn't reach for her wand with a trembling hand. She pressed her palm to the brass plate. The metal flared with a warm, welcoming gold. Draco had added her signature to the wards a week ago, a silent, tectonic shift in the geography of his life. The deadbolts tumbled back with a soft, melodic thrum, and the door swung open to reveal the steep, beeswax-scented stairwell. She climbed the steps, the hollow echo of her boots a domestic grounding sound. When she reached the second-floor landing, the door to the flat was already ajar. A spill of warm, amber light flooded the hallway. Hermione stepped inside. The flat was no longer a stark, slate-grey cell of penance. The fire in the hearth was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows across the rug where they had once sought shelter from the storm. The stacks of books on the desk were still there, but they were joined by a second chair, a velvet one in a deep, muted crimson that sat flush against his cracked leather armchair. Draco was standing by the window, his back to her. He had shed his heavy coat, wearing only a thin black linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up his forearms. The silver ring on his finger caught the firelight as he traced a pattern in the condensation on the glass. The magnetic pull was instantaneous. The tactile friction in the room was no longer a spark of static. It was a deep, resonant hum that filled her lungs, making it easy to breathe for the first time all day. He didn't turn around immediately, but his shoulders lost their rigid, defensive set. He exhaled, a long, rhythmic release of tension. The bridges opened for foot traffic as of 4 o'clock, he murmured. His baritone was no longer a hollow rasp. It was rich, grounded, and laced with a quiet, undeniable warmth. I watched the first crowd cross from here. They looked like ants reclaiming a hill. "It's a sturdy bridge, Draco," Hermione said, walking toward him. She placed the terracotta pot on the mahogany side cabinet, right next to the glass decanter of fire whiskey. It was built to last this time. Draco finally turned. The light from the hearth hit his face, and Hermione felt a familiar, sharp intake of breath. The hollows of his cheeks were less pronounced, and the bruised shadows beneath his eyes had faded into a soft, weary contentment. He looked like a man who was finally learning how to sleep without the lights on. He looked at the moon fern, then at her. A ghost of a genuine, lopsided smile touched the corner of his mouth. "A shadow dweller," he observed, his silver eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unblinking clarity. "Appropriate, Granger, though I suspect you intend to overwater it with your relentless optimism." "I intend to make sure it doesn't wither in the dark," she countered, closing the final 3 feet between them. The approach was complete. There was no more repulsion, no more doubt, no more freezing retreats behind ancestral names. The internal conflict that had defined their lives for a decade had been refined in the fire of that one rainy night, leaving behind something raw and unbreakable. Draco reached out, his hands sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The scent of him, cedar, bergamot, and the faint, sweet smell of the tea he'd been brewing, wrapped around her like a physical embrace. "You're late," he whispered, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "I almost convinced myself the wards had rejected you. I almost convinced myself the bridge had collapsed again." "The bridge is fine," Hermione breathed, her hands sliding up his chest to tangle in the soft, silk-fine hair at the nape of his neck. "And I'm not going anywhere." The atmospheric pressure in the room peaked, but it wasn't suffocating. It was a solid, supportive weight. Draco's hands tightened on the small of her back, his thumbs tracing the line of her spine through her coat. The show don't tell of his touch was a library of confessions, of gratitude, of hunger, and of a love that was still too new to be spoken aloud, but too large to be contained. He leaned down, his lips ghosting against hers for a heartbeat, a hesitant, reverent question. Hermione answered it by pulling him down the final inch. The kiss was the resolution of the entire story. It wasn't the desperate collision of the storm or the defiant claim of the riverbank. It was a slow, certain exploration. It tasted of home. It was the sound of a final shift in the universe, the moment where the enemies truly, irrevocably became lovers. Draco groaned softly into her mouth, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He kissed her with a slow-burn intensity that made her knees weak, his tongue tracing the curve of her lip as if he were memorizing a spell he never wanted to finish casting. They stayed there for a long time, anchored to each other in the center of the amber-lit room. Outside, the city of London continued its frantic, noisy reconstruction. People crossed the new bridge, unaware that the most important restoration had happened in a quiet, slate-grey flat 2 streets away. Draco broke the kiss, but he didn't pull away. He tucked her head under his chin, his arms wrapping around her in a protective, permanent circle. "Stay," he whispered, the word no longer a plea, but a statement of fact. "Always," she replied. The internal monologue was finally silent. The ghosts of the manor had stopped screaming. The bridge was built, the storm had passed, and the moon fern began to unfurl its silver leaves in the soft, manageable shadows of their shared life. It was a happy ending, not because the world had changed, but because they had. In the quiet, flickering light of the hearth, Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger let go of the war and simply held onto each other.
Thank you for listening to this story. I wrote these words on a day when it was raining. I watched the water on my window. I thought about how a storm can change everything. Draco and Hermione were enemies for a long time. They had many scars, but in this story, the rain forced them to stop fighting. It forced them to see each other. Sometimes we all feel like a broken bridge. We feel stuck on the wrong side of the river. But even in the dark, there is warmth. Even a person from your past can become your future. I hope this story felt like a warm blanket. I hope it made you believe in a second chance. Love is not always about a bright sun. Sometimes love is just staying together until the rain stops. Thank you for being here with me. Until next time.